Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am sorry to pull you in and out of Deltarune hell. But we'll pull you out for just a second, because I acknowledge it is easy to criticize, and I'm very critical of a lot of the theorizing that we see on the internet today. Fandoms often get it wrong, in my opinion. So let's be the change that we'd like to see. If we want people to analyze characters better, it's good to demonstrate how to do that analysis. So let's dive right into one of the biggest questions so far as of Chapter 4. Who is the Roaring Knight in Deltarune? Now, the frankest and most realistic answer is that we just don't know. With any incompleted or partially completed work of fiction, you just have to get used to this understanding that you don't know. We just don't know. However, we are going to speculate, and that's going to involve spoilers, so if you don't want that, I would suggest you stop watching now. For those still interested and who've already played the game, here we go. Now, the Knight, or what we presume to be the Knight, doesn't really appear until Chapter 3. They introduce themselves by brutally murdering the TV, and then attempt to wipe out the squad. Now, I don't know what you guys named your team, but they are the squad in my game, so that's how I'll be referring to them. Then they appear again in Chapter 4, and at this point they are a primary antagonist. So who are they? Well, one of the most common and compelling theories is that this individual is December, Noelle's sister. Just going by physical appearance, this doesn't seem like a bad theory. December would be a reindeer, and the Knight has reindeer antlers. The Knight has a bit of an hourglass figure, which implies they could be female, like December, but the Knight also does a fair amount of shape-shifting, so this isn't great supporting evidence. However, on that note, we can say that this is a very edgy character design, and that's pretty fitting for Des. When we get to see the inside of the holiday house, we see that her door is black, and then once we go inside, we can tell this is clearly a girl going through a phase. But more than that, we can actually see a lot of motifs of the dark world. Those stars on the wall, I bet those glow in the dark. The paint job on the wall looks like a bunch of twisting shadows, and then check out these posters on the closet. We've got the sword, and then we've got this, I don't know, might be a calculator dripping with inky blackness? More stars and stuff on another poster. Not to mention that these are handmade, and it's been established through Spamton that items that are personal to someone has more power in the dark world. Not to say that Des's room is specifically associated with the dark world, but that her ideas brought to the dark world might be very powerful. Then over here we see this mangled up wiffle bat. It's clearly been abused all to destruction, and the Knight's main weapon appears to be some kind of baseball bat. Now, none of this is a smoking gun that says the Knight is Des, but it seems that we're definitely supposed to be making the connection. Now, there is one hitch with the Des theory. She's supposed to be missing, possibly dead. But at the end of Chapter 3, it appears that the Knight kidnaps Undyne and then runs her all the way to the shelter. Now, as it turns out, we're also shown in Chapter 4 that being dead doesn't mean that Des can't be the Knight. We learned through Gerson in Chapter 4 that if an item is close to the deceased, that item can be used to bring a person back to life in the dark world. But if Des is dead, she shouldn't be able to leave the dark world. So how would she transport Undyne all the way to the shelter from Chris's house? One possibility is that she isn't dead at all. She's only missing. She's been in the dark world most of this time and for some reason just never came out. But we also learn in Chapter 3 that it appears that Chris is collaborating with someone, we presume the Knight. So there might be multiple collaborators, multiple conspirators, and it could simply be that somebody was waiting outside Chris's house for the handoff. In that case, Des would be dead, and her living accomplice is the one who dragged Undyne off. There's further implication that the Knight might not be able to leave the dark world because at the end of Chapter 4, Susie threatens to kick the Knight's ass if they met in the real world, and then the Knight laughs. Now, it could be that the Knight is laughing because Susie is no match for them in the real world, or the Knight might be laughing because Susie is revealing the level of her ignorance, and the Knight finds that funny. What an amusing thought. Were the Knight to leave, they would be dead. Susie is 100% correct, but she just doesn't know how hilariously right she is. If this is Des, then Chris also has a lot of reasons to want to collaborate with her, because we know that Chris cared about Des. And so did Carol, and Rudy, and Noelle. Ralsei seems to be based on Azriel, but that's a completely different subject. But at any rate, starting in Chapter 2, Des is referenced frequently, and she continues to be referenced throughout Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 in little bits and pieces. So it seems that she's probably going to be important somehow, and she's a very good candidate to be the Knight. However, what if Des isn't the Knight? That is a possibility. What if the Knight is Carol, Noelle's mother? During the visit to Noelle's house, you get a hold of Des's guitar, which for some reason has the shelter's code in it. Not sure why that is. Seems convenient, but that's not here or there. And after this, Chris has a phone call with someone, and they say, "I'll be right there." Minutes later, Carol arrives, and then kicks you out of the house. This so strongly implies that Carol is the knight that many people dismiss it as a red herring offhand. After all, it would be too easy if someone on the phone who appears to be the knight says, "Hang on, I'll be there in a second," and then a character walks in the room and that's them. After all, it seems like we're not meant to know who the knight is at this point, so if it's Carol, then we already know and the mystery is over. But does Carol have the motive to be the knight? And I think that she does. This depends, of course, on how exactly Des was lost, and whether or not Carol knows anything about dark worlds. If Des got lost in a dark world, then Carol might be looking for her. Or, if Des was brought back to life by a dark world, Carol would be very reluctant to let Des go. This would be extremely fitting for a lot of the themes that you see throughout the game. You see lots of times that many characters talk about feelings of abandonment, or moving on, or trying to seek freedom. If her daughter can only be alive in the dark world, then Carol would have a very good reason to want to spread darkness across the entire planet. It sets her daughter free. Her daughter can be alive anywhere and do anything. This would be a very good thing from Carol's perspective. However, aside from the fact that it seems like Carol is a blatant red herring, why would Carol laugh when Susie threatens to kick her ass in the real world? Carol seems like she has a very cold and serious personality, so why would she find that funny? Well, it is the case that Susie was at her house just that afternoon, and Carol was able to throw Susie out of the house without Susie hardly putting up a fight. So that thought could be amusing. It could also simply be that Carol is a co-conspirator. She's working with Chris and possibly the knight to do whatever it is they're trying to do. Unleash the dark worlds maybe. If the knight is Des, then Carol would be trying to unleash the knight on the whole world. At this point, we just don't have enough information to say for sure. But although she is probably a red herring, I kind of like the idea of Carol being the knight. Imagine a mother working so hard to find and rescue her daughter from a magical land that she becomes some kind of a twisted abomination in the process, and yet still doesn't stop. That is a tragic and poignant character, and I don't know that's the direction the story is going, but it could really resonate and strike some chords. But okay, let's suppose it's not Des and it's not Carol. At this point, we start to get a little bit thin. We can look at the last of the Holiday family and say, why not Rudy? In fact, he'd have the same motivations that Carol could have. And as Des's father, it might not be too outlandish to imagine him as being the knight. It's not at all unusual for, during children's games, the dad to play the knight to his princess. He's going to rescue his daughter from evil villains or whatever. It could be that he became sick because of some interaction in the dark world, or perhaps his illness is being reflected in the dark world as having kind of a grotesque life of its own. That would explain why the knight's chest explodes during some scenes. However, I have to confess, the idea that dad saves the world, or at least dad saves his kids, it may resonate with me, as a father myself, but as compelling of a story as it could be, Rudy doesn't really seem to hint at all that this is the case. We can interact with him in at least 3 chapters, and in none of them does he indicate that he's aware of anything bigger. So could he be the knight? He's got the motive, and possibly, but there's really no supporting evidence of it. Well, but what about other characters? I've seen it theorized that maybe Asgore could be the knight. We have a scene where he's monologuing suspiciously in the other room, and after Chris makes his phone call, Asgore shows up and gets in the way. And, for some reason, in Chapter 3, the knight attempts to kidnap Toriel. Now, Asgore does have motive to want to have Toriel in his life. He keeps talking about getting her back, so that's something. But if the whole point of the knight's attack was to kidnap Toriel, to maybe reconcile their relationship, why would the knight then be fine with just taking Undyne and hiding in the shelter? You'd think that if this were Asgore, and his core objective was to kidnap Toriel for his relationship reasons, that Toriel would be his main objective, and Undyne could not be a substitute. Beyond that, we really just haven't been given a motive for Asgore to be the knight. We could make things up, but nothing has been directly shown to us. Yes, he acts suspiciously, but that could just as easily be another red herring. Then, of course, if it were Asgore, why would he laugh when Susie threatens to kick his ass at the end of the chapter? So Asgore is a very powerful man, he could probably beat Susie, he's got her outweighed probably at least 3-1, but he doesn't really strike me as the kind of guy who would relish beating up a teenage girl. Neither does Rudy for that matter, but in Rudy's case, Rudy does like to laugh, and Rudy is very sick in the real world, so the idea of losing a fight to a teenage girl in the real world is again funny because she's right and she just doesn't know how right she is. If I had to choose between one of these two characters, I would say that Rudy is the more practical, but that doesn't mean that Asgore isn't necessarily collaborating with whoever the knight's accomplices are. Still though, I have my skepticisms even of that, because the pattern with Asgore seems to be that the man is hopelessly pathetic and harmless. He may have the capacity to do harm, but he seems to lack the drive or the ambition to. I could be wrong on that front, but I really don't think it's him. And then finally, we have people who question, what if it's Azrael? We really don't know anything about Azrael, and that's part of what makes this theory so convincing and appealing, at least to some. I'll grant the knight could be Azrael, but if he were, it would be coming a little bit out of left field, because to this point, we haven't actually seen or heard from Azrael at all. The theory goes that Azrael never went to college as he stated, but rather went into the dark world and has been there ever since. He might be looking for Des or trying to rescue Des, as many of the other possible culprits are. And if the knight were Chris's brother, it could explain why the knight takes things easy on Chris during their battle. While it's not impossible that the knight could be Azrael, and it's not that far-fetched of a theory knowing the potential motives, there's no supporting evidence in the story so far that says it would be him. For one thing, it's mentioned a couple of times that Azrael took an interest in the fire mage, so you would think that he would have fire-related powers, and in that case, you would think that the knight would be using fire spells. Rather, it looks like they're using ice-related attacks. In fact, the knight seems closely related to the cold and snow and blizzards, so it's probably not Azrael, it's much more likely it's one of the holidays. Given that that is the case, we could also speculate that maybe Noelle is the knight, but that would be so out of left field I haven't really seen anyone seriously entertain the idea. We sometimes get a look at Noelle's inner thoughts, and we know that she's never really experienced a dark world before, she doesn't know what they are, she thinks that they're all dreams. So the only possibility for her to be the knight would be if she had, for example, a split personality, which generally is a terrible and unfun writing mechanic, or she's just unconsciously the knight, which is also a bit unfair to the audience. It might be a convenient twist to say that Noelle didn't actually know her own motives or why she was the knight in the first place, and that's why it's a twist, but that's cheating. Noelle being the knight and just not realizing it could explain how they got trapped in the cyber world during Chapter 2, but if Noelle were the one who made the fountain, then in theory, Birdley should have seen it happen. Noelle being the knight, after all, would be such an unlikely and unfun twist that I sincerely hope it's not the case, and I expect it isn't. So, who else? We really don't have very many other candidates. We can rule out Toriel, Chris, Susie, Ralsei, and Undyne because they're all seen in the same place at the same time as the knight, so that leaves virtually everybody else in town, potentially. Or beyond. Or perhaps the knight isn't anybody, it's just a creature from the darkness that's summoned to do somebody else's bidding. Many in the fandom, especially those who get really deep into these kinds of theories, might be quick to point out that Gaster could be a potential source of the knight. But anytime we implicate Gaster, we always have to ask the same question. Why Gaster? What would he add to the story if he was behind things? Far-fetched though he may be, I could see how Rudy being the knight might still tell a compelling tale. It's a father trying to rescue his daughter. That's touching in a way. But Gaster just sending the knight to mess with people because he's, I don't know, a dark scientist or crazy? Just seeing what happens? Is that really a better story? I don't find that very compelling, personally. I feel that that might be the least interesting story that we could possibly tell with all the pieces we've been given so far. It would be like being handed all the pieces of a murder mystery and then blaming the butler simply because the butler's motives haven't really been explained much, and it could be him. Why not just say the butler wanted to do all of it, and then he did? It's very simple and would explain everything, but makes a terrible story. As it is, after all, we don't even know 100% that Gaster is in the Deltarune setting. Yes, there is a man who sounds like Gaster who speaks to you at the start of the game and during the ending credits or if you lose, but he's not a character present in the game. And if he is present somewhere, we don't yet know what he's doing or what he cares about or even what he's like. So I hope for all of our sakes that if Gaster is behind it, then in some chapter we'll spend a lot of time fleshing out what kind of character he is and why we're meant to care about him. Otherwise, that would be the worst possible answer. So there it is. Those are the possibilities of who could be the knight as of Chapter 4 based on how I see it. And this is how I like to think about theories in fiction. It's important to try to figure out not just what would be the quickest way that we could pin everything on one person, but maybe what's the most compelling thing that could be true, and why would we like that over something else? After all, the point is not just to get to the end and have an answer, it's to tell the story. Now, it could very well be that the knight is anybody else. It could be Papyrus, for all we know, or maybe even Temmie. But to better support that kind of argument, you would have to see more details in a future chapter, and we'd require more writing that explains to us why we would care if any of those characters happen to be the knight or associated with them. At any rate, this is it. This is not a Deltarune channel, so I'm not going to do more Deltarune content. for real this time, if you enjoyed this, go to hell, we're done with it, and have a wonderful day.